Model Test 6, Listening Section.
The listening section tests your ability to understand spoken English that is typical of interactions and academic speech on college campuses. During the test, you will respond to conversations and lectures. This is the short format for the listening section. On the short format, you will respond to 2 conversations and 4 lectures. After each listening passage, you will answer 5 to 6 questions about it. You will hear each conversation or lecture one time. You may take notes while you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Choose the best answer for multiple choice questions. Follow the directions on the page or on the screen for computer-assisted questions. Click on Next and OK to go to the next question. You cannot return to previous questions. You have 25 to 30 minutes to answer all of the questions. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to complete your answers for the section. The clock does not count the time you are listening to the conversations and lectures.
Listening 1, Professor's Office.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Hi, Dr. Davis. I'm a little early. Should I wait outside?
No, come on in. I'm free. What did you want to talk about?
Well, I've read the first couple of books you had on my list, the reading list for my independent study, and I was just wondering how you want me to report them to you. We didn't really talk about that.
Well, I'm glad you stopped by. Let me think. Didn't you have a project to do in addition to the reading list?
Yes. You said it could be a research paper, or I could come up with a proposal for a different kind of project.
That's right. So the reading list is background information then. Why don't you just come in when you finish the first part of the list? I think it was divided in 2 distinct parts. So just come in and we'll talk about the readings.
You mean I should prepare a synopsis of each book and kind of report to you on each one?
No, nothing as formal as that. I was thinking more along the lines of a conversation. As I recall, the list has a focus, doesn't it?
Definitely. All of the books are novels and plays from the second half of the 20th century.
The postmodern period, then. And all North American novelists and playwrights.
Right.
So we should be able to find some common threads, then. Remember, though, postmodernism is very difficult to define precisely. Maybe we could start with a discussion of the themes that emerge in the collection of literature from that period.
That sounds interesting.
I think so, too. And by the time you get through with the second half of the reading list and we get together again, maybe we can figure out whether we're looking at a logical extension of postmodernism or whether there's actually a new movement there in the readings on the second part. If you'll notice, there are quite a few minority writers represented, so you might want to think about what that means.
I noticed that in the list. The first part of the list has the usual North American writers and, of course, a good representation of women writers, as you'd expect. But the second part of the list includes a number of African American authors, several Hispanic American writers, and a few Oriental Americans.
It's a multi-ethnic mix.
Yeah.
Good. So, have you decided whether you want to do a paper or something else, perhaps?
To tell the truth, I'd really like to do something a little more creative. Maybe bring in some visuals on the computer as part of I suppose you'd call it a mixed media report. But I've never done anything like that before.
But that's what an independent study is designed to do. It's an opportunity to experiment and to have some one-on-one time with a professor.
But a research paper is easier in some ways. At least I know that I can do a decent job. The computer project's unknown territory.
True, but remember it's unknown territory for all of us. I think I've heard some references to cybermodernism. If you want to investigate some of the work that's being created in, as you call it, mixed media literature.
Cybermodernism? Wow.
I think you'd find it interesting. Anyway, it's up to you. It's your project.
Thanks. I'm really excited about doing this independent study. Actually, I'm spending more time on it than on any of my other classes.
I've found that students usually invest more time and energy in a class that they can design. That's why I like to direct them. Oh, and Terry, If you run into any problems, don't wait until you're halfway through your reading list. Just stop by during my office hours. Maybe I can give you some references or at least a sounding board.
Thanks. This is better than I even expected.
1. Why does the man go to see his professor? Two. How is the second part of the reading list different from the first part? Three. Listen again to part of the conversation and then answer the following question.
I think I've heard some references to cybermodernism. If you want to investigate some of the work that's being created in, as you call it, mixed media literature.
Cybermodernism? Wow.
What does the man mean when he says this?
Cybermodernism? Wow.
Four. What will the man probably do before the next meeting? Five. What can be inferred about the professor?
Listening 2. Environmental Science Class.
Listen to part of a lecture in an environmental science class. The professor is talking about wind power.
Today I want to talk with you about another renewable source of energy, wind power. This isn't a new concept. In fact, wind's been used for centuries to pump water and launch sailing vessels. But more recently, wind power has been used to generate electricity. By the year 2000, California was using maybe 15,000 wind turbines to produce about 400 megawatts of electricity. And that was happening at a cost that would be considered competitive with coal or nuclear power. And although California currently leads the United States in harnessing wind power, there are several other areas that also hold considerable potential for increased production. Texas and the Dakotas alone have enough wind potential to power the nation. But since the winds there are so variable, well, wind power alone would be unreliable as a primary source of continuous energy. Nevertheless, it could be used as a secondary resource, along with fossil fuels. The strong and steady winds of the Pacific Northwest, especially in the Columbia River Basin, these winds would be ideal as a supplement to hydroelectric power when the river's experiencing periods of low water levels. Studies by the U.S. Department of Energy indicate that wind power generated from the Great Plains in the middle of the country could supply the continental United States with almost 75% of the electricity required for the region. In another section of the same report, it was noted that wind powers the world's fastest-growing energy source. Since 1998, the capacity for wind energies increased by more than 35% worldwide. And improvements in wind turbine technology in the past couple of decades has improved efficiency, cutting the cost dramatically from roughly 40 cents to about 4 cents per kilowatt hour. And a new turbine designs being tested with a lower torque so that may actually move the price closer to 3 cents. Europe currently accounts for over 70% of the world's wind power. India, China, Germany, Denmark, Italy, and Spain have published plans for major increases in wind-generated electricity projects in the next few years, and recent interest and exploration have been initiated in the United Kingdom and Brazil. Remote areas, especially islands, and other regions at a distance from electrical grids are vigorously exploring wind options. Clearly, the global implications, not only for cheap energy, but also for clean energy, could be enormous. And in some areas, the consumers are even willing to pay a subsidy for the pollution-free energy that wind provides their communities. In Colorado, for instance, through a program called WindSource. About 10,000 customers pay an additional $2.50 per month for every 100 kilowatt hours of wind power. Legislation in several states in the United States now requires utility companies to guarantee that a percentage of their electricity will be generated from renewable sources like wind power. Of course, there are some problems associated with wind power that do need to be considered. The blades on the turbines present a hazard to migrating birds. In some cases, the vibrations interfere with television reception in the area. And there's been objections to wind farms because they produce noise and because they're not visually appealing to residents nearby. So in addition to the studies to improve turbine design and energy efficiency, some of the attendant problems also require research and development. Regarding the noise, let me mention that design modifications, basically modifying the thickness of the turbine blades and making adjustments to the orientation of the turbines, these modifications have diminished the noise substantially in a number of sites. As for visual appeal, some creative ways to share the land to create a more attractive wind farm are being piloted. So that brings us to the issue of storing wind power. And although wind energy can be stored temporarily as battery power, the real challenge for wind power exploration will be how to level out the energy source. Alternatives for storage will be critical because even in an area with steady winds, wind's still not totally reliable. But the TELUS Institute has released promising results from studies to investigate the problem of intermittent wind. This is what they did. By dividing the wind turbines from one farm into two smaller farms with geographical separation, the capacity of the pair of farms increased by 33.33% over the efficiency of the larger farm with the same number of turbines. So, by taking advantage of the slightly different wind patterns, a more continuous supply of wind power can be generated. So, where are we with all of this? Well, the research that'll make wind power a viable option is underway, but we need to continue to study in order to solve some of the problems before we can use wind power as a primary source of energy globally.
6. What aspect of wind power is the lecture mainly about? Seven. Which two regions of the United States have the greatest potential for supplying wind power? Eight. Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
Europe currently accounts for over 70% of the world's wind power. India, China, Germany, Denmark, Italy, and Spain have published plans for major increases in wind-generated electricity projects in the next few years, and recent interest and exploration have been initiated in the United Kingdom and Brazil.
Why does the professor say this?
Europe currently accounts for over 70% of the world's wind power.
Nine. In the lecture, the professor identifies several problems associated with wind power. Indicate whether each of the following is one of the problems mentioned. Click in the correct box for each phrase. Ten. How did the TELUS Institute solve the problem of intermittent wind? 11. What is the professor's opinion about the future of wind power?
Listening 3. Philosophy class.
Listen to part of a discussion in a philosophy class.
The earliest Greek philosophers also known as the pre-Socratic philosophers, they were very interested in determining the nature of the universe. Initially, Thales proposed that water was the original material from which all other material was derived, and by that he was referring not only to things on Earth, but also in the heavens. He observed that life sprouts from a moist ground, unlike death that dries and shrivels into dust. The fact that water could transform itself into a solid, as it does when it freezes into ice, or it could change into air as it does when heated into steam, well, this convinced him that everything had originated as water and would eventually return to water. He believed that all things are living things, including rocks and metals, and so literally everything would transform itself into the original material, water, in a logical pattern of change. A little later, Anaximander, and he was a student of Thales, so Anaximander was set on a path that involved questioning which of the elements was the most basic or fundamental. But he suggested that the universe was not originally made up of water, as Thales had reasoned, but was a living mass, which he called the infinite. The word in Greek actually means unlimited, but most translators have used the term infinite since it probably captures the meaning a little better in English. So, Anaximander put forward what some believe is the first theoretical postulate, that the infinite was constantly in motion, up and down, back and forth. So, although the infinite had begun as a whole, the motion had caused pieces to be broken off to form all of the elements of the universe, the earth, the sun, stars. Then, he speculated that as the oceans had begun to evaporate, the first sea plants and animals had formed, and from them, their descendants, the birds and land animals, evolved, until finally, mankind was created.
That sounds a lot like evolutionary theory.
Yes, it does. Probably the first instance of evolutionary theory among Europeans, although the Chinese philosophers had discussed this possibility earlier. Okay, so what do you think he postulated about the continued motion of the universe? Anyone?
I remember that part. He thought that all of these separate elements would eventually be put back together into the original infinite mass.
Precisely right. But good students think for themselves, and some years later, Anaximander's student, Anaximenes, criticized his teacher's view. He deduced that the original element of the universe was air, which was timeless and boundless, and in fact, alive. Because mankind and all the animals must breathe air in order to survive, he believed, therefore, that air had been transformed into blood, bone, and flesh. He also concluded that air was the origin of water, stone, and earth, and I think you can see the analogy with the parts of the body there. Furthermore, he contended that the solid condensations of air constituted the body of the world, but the ethereal quality of air constituted the spirit of the world, and it was the spirit that remained alive forever. Now, these three philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, they were all residents of Miletus, and were very active beginning about 600 years before the Christian era. So, they were called the Milesian philosophers, and they all had different views, but they also had something in common.
Do you mean that they were all materialists? Because they were trying to explain the universe in terms of perceivable elements like water and air?
Good observation. Let's take that a step further. They all attempted to explain the unknown in terms of the familiar, instead of looking to the current mythologies or to a divine presence. And that's what is truly extraordinary about these pre-Socratic philosophers. A naturalistic account of the cosmos was profoundly different from the myths and legends of gods and goddesses that had been the basis for explaining the origin of the universe.
So what do you mean by naturalistic?
I mean that they tried to use scientific arguments, and this marked a very new way of thinking. Unlike the exciting narratives of superhuman beings with the powers to create and change the universe, they proposed that the universe was made up of something very basic, and that it was constantly undergoing natural changes. The Milesians made a major contribution, and they did this by moving beyond the old mythologies and folk tales, and some scholars even suggest that they were responsible for the beginnings of Western philosophy as we know it. Now, when we talk about philosophy, it's important to point out that for many centuries, philosophy was not a separate discipline from other areas of thought and knowledge. In fact, early philosophers were mathematicians, physicists, chemists, and biologists before any of these sciences were identified as separate subjects or fields of study. So the pre-Socratic philosophers were trying to discover a scientific basis for the universe long before the scientific method and the technologies were available to support their investigations. But really, many scholars argue that these philosophers did initiate the process, at least, and the process eventually resulted, years later, as the beginning of the physical sciences. Okay, all of this appears on the surface to be very positive, right? But at the time, many philosophers, as well as ordinary citizens, were feeling much less comfortable with the very sparse tenets of emerging science than they had been with the rich and complicated stories that had explained the universe for them. Remember that this is all before Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, who were, by then, more able to expand on proto-scientific thought and produce a massive and elaborate scientific alternative to the ancient beliefs.
12. What is the discussion mainly about? (13) Why does the student mention evolutionary theory? 14. Listen again to part of the discussion and then answer the following question.
Do you mean that they were all materialists? Because they were trying to explain the universe in terms of perceivable elements like water and air?
Good observation. Let's take that a step further.
Why does the professor say this?
Good observation. Let's take that a step further.
15. What view did the three Milesian philosophers share? (16) What can be inferred about the early Greek philosophers? 17. Listen again to part of the discussion and then answer the following question.
Okay, all of this appears on the surface to be very positive, right? But at the time, many philosophers, as well as ordinary citizens, were feeling much less comfortable with the very sparse tenets of emerging science than they had been with the rich and complicated stories that had explained the universe for them.
What does the professor mean when she says this?
Okay, all of this appears on the surface to be very positive, right?
Listening 4. Professor's Office.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Excuse me, Professor Jones. I was wondering whether I could talk with you for a minute. If you're busy now, though.
Sure, Ann. What's up?
Well, I've been working on my research project. I'm doing it on decaffeinated beverages.
Oh, I remember. That's going to be interesting. How's it going?
Good. I've got all the data, but the report's turning out to be fairly short. It took such a long time to do the research, I thought I'd have a lot more to write about.
Well, how long will it be, do you think?
Probably 5 or 6 pages, and that includes a couple of pages with charts in them.
That sounds about right.
It does?
Yes. Oh, of course, it depends on what you included in the 5 pages. The issue here is whether the research design was well thought out and whether you have all the information in your report that you need to explain what you did, the approach, and the results that you found.
Okay. I have a short introduction, just a few paragraphs, really. So that's about caffeine. And then I talk about the benefits of decaffeination and several ways to do that.
Uh-huh. What else?
Well, I explain my research design, and that's sort of a problem too, because I'm not sure whether to make this sound like a book. You know, the way the studies are explained in our textbook, or whether I should just write it up as clearly as I can so that anyone would understand what I did.
I'd go for that option. In fact, why don't you ask a few friends to read it before you turn it in? If your friends get it, that's a good indication that you've explained it well. But if they have a lot of questions, then maybe you need to do some rewriting. And Anne, it's even better if your friends aren't chemistry majors like you are.
Well, I would never have thought of that.
Then I'm glad I suggested it. By the way, did you include references at the end of your study?
Just 2. That's all I used.
Okay, good. Just as long as you cite the references you used.
Well, thanks. This is the first time I've ever done my own research. It was hard because I didn't have any experience, but it was fun, too. I was thinking about trying to get a part-time job as a lab assistant next year.
I think you'd be a good candidate. In fact, why don't you write up a draft of that report and I'll look it over for you before you hand in the final copy.
That would be perfect. I could bring it in on Monday, since that's when you have your usual office hours. Would that be okay?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
Oh, right.
Okay, then, why don't you bring it to class on Friday?
It'd be great.
And Anne, if you're really serious about that lab assistant position, I can give you some information about that when I see you.
Oh, I can't thank you enough.
Not at all, Anne. You've got a lot going for you. I'm glad to help.
18. Why does the woman want to talk with her professor? 19. What advice does the professor give the woman? 20. What does the professor offer to do? 21. Listen again to part of the conversation, and then answer the following question.
I could bring it in on Monday, since that's when you have your usual office hours. Would that be okay?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
Oh, right.
Why does the professor say this?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
22. What is the professor's opinion of the woman?
5. Biology class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class. The professor is talking about bacteria.
Bacteria is the common name for a very large group of one-celled microscopic organisms that we believe may be the smallest, simplest, and perhaps even the very first forms of cellular life that evolved on Earth. Because they're so small, bacteria must be measured in microns, with 1 micron measuring about 0.00004 inches long. Most bacteria range from about 0.1 microns to about 4 microns wide and about 0.2 microns to almost 50 microns long. So, how can we observe them? I'll give you one guess. Under the microscope, of course. As I said, bacteria are very primitive and simple. In fact, they're unicellular, which means that they're made up of a single cell. We think they probably evolved about 3.5 billion years ago. Some of the oldest fossils are bacterial organisms. They've been found almost everywhere on Earth, including all the continents, seas, and freshwater habitats, and in the tissues of both plants and animals. Well, since they're so prevalent, you might ask, how do they reproduce? Okay, they grow in colonies and can reproduce quite rapidly, in fact, by a process called fission. In fission, the cell, and remember, there's only one in bacteria, one cell. So the cell increases in size and then splits in two parts. Fission's also referred to in your text as asexual budding. Now, you'll also read about conjugation, and that's when two separate bacteria exchange pieces of DNA. So there are two ways that reproduction can occur, but we think that fission's more common. Okay, bacteria were virtually unknown until about 1600, when microscopes were introduced. And at that time, bacteria were observed and classified into three main types according to their shapes. And that classification hasn't really changed that much over the years. So that's what I want to talk about today, the main types of bacteria. The slides that I'm going to show you are enlargements of bacteria that I observed under the microscope in the lab earlier today. Now, this first slide is an example of bacilli. The bacilli are a group of bacteria that occur in the soil and air. As you can see, they're shaped like rods. And if you were to see them in motion, they'd be rolling or tumbling under the microscope. Of course, you can't see that because this is a still visual. But later, when you go into the lab, you'll see that rolling motion in examples of bacilli. These are kind of a greenish blue, but some are yellow. So don't try to identify them by their color. Look at the shape. These bacilli are largely responsible for food spoilage. Okay, the next slide's a very different shape of bacteria. It's referred to as the cocci group, and it tends to grow in clusters or chains, like this example. This specimen's one of the common streptococci bacteria that cause strep throat. Finally, let's look at the spiral-shaped bacteria called the spirilla. This is the spirilla. They look a little like corkscrews, and they're responsible for a number of diseases in humans. But I don't want you to get the wrong idea. It's true that some species of bacteria do cause diseases, but for the most part, bacteria are benign. There's a lot of bacteria in this room, in fact. We all have it on us. They live harmlessly on the skin, in the mouth, and in the intestines. In fact, bacteria are very helpful to researchers because bacterial cells resemble the cells of other life forms in many ways and may be studied to give us insights. For example, we have a major research project in genetics here at the university. Since bacteria reproduce very rapidly, we're using them to determine how certain characteristics are inherited. Okay, now, let me review these three types with you. Cocci are spheres, bacilli are rods, and spirillae are spirals. One of my students came up with a way to remember them. Just try to visualize the first letter in the name of each of the different types. Cocci starts with C, like the shape of half a sphere. Bacilli starts with a straight line on the B, and a rod is straight. Spirilla starts with an S, and that's a spiral shape. If it helps you, use it. In any case, although I want you to know the three major classifications, within these basic groups there are virtually hundreds of variations that make them somewhat more difficult to identify and classify than the rather straightforward specimens that I showed you a minute ago. Because you see, bacteria can join in chains, clusters, pairs, and sometimes more than one type of bacteria may be found together in a specimen. I think you get the picture. Okay then, in addition to identifying bacteria by their shape, which we now know isn't really a very good method for distinguishing them easily, if we really want to identify what type of bacteria we're dealing with, it's better to study the biochemistry or genetic structure of the specimen. They have one chromosome of double-stranded DNA in a ring, which we can analyze fairly easily.
23. What aspect of bacteria is this lecture mainly about? 24. Which of the following slides contain cockeye bacteria? (25) Which two characteristics are common in bacteria? (26) Why are bacteria being used in the research study at the university? (27) How does the professor help the students to remember the types of bacteria? (28) Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
Because you see, bacteria can join in chains, clusters, pairs, and sometimes more than one type of bacteria may be found together in a specimen. I think you get the picture.
Why does the professor say this?
I think you get the picture.
Listening 6. History class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a history class.
Frontier home design in the United States was greatly influenced by the provisions of the Homestead Act of 1862. The legislation gave settlers the right to open land, but mandated that homesteaders build a structure that was at least 10 by 12 feet and included at least one glass window. And they had to live on their homestead and improve the land for 5 years before their claim was recognized. Of course, when they first arrived, most homesteaders lived in their wagons or pitched tents until they filed claims and planted crops. And even then, knowing that fully half of the homesteaders wouldn't make it through the 5 years required to complete their claims, homesteaders tended to view the construction of their homes as semi-permanent dwellings. More likely, they'd build something better later or try to improve on what they'd built initially if they made it through the first 5 years. So, in addition to the requirements in the Homestead Act, the settlers needed a home that was easy to build, cheap, and maybe even disposable. Well, the log cabin's the construction that comes to mind when we think of Western settlements. But the plains and the prairies had so few trees that log construction was almost impossible. So the sod house was a practical solution for homesteaders on flat, treeless land. So how do you build a sod house? Well, first you wait for a rain that makes the earth soft. Then you use a sod cutter to form sod bricks about 2 or 3 feet square and a few inches thick. Then you stack the bricks to form walls and weave branches or twigs and grass into a roof that's finally covered with sod as well. Now, there were tremendous advantages to this type of construction. In the first place, it was very cheap. There are journals from the 1800s that document construction prices at about $2.50, and most of that was for the glass window. And it took very little time to build, probably a day or two, and the thick walls actually kept the house quite cool in the summer and fairly warm in the winter. If a better home could be built later, the sod house would simply dissolve into the soil. But there were serious disadvantages as well. Even well-built roofs leaked onto the dirt floors, forming mud puddles, and sometimes the roof even collapsed from the water weight. Or in dry spells, the dirt crumbled from the roof into the home, not to mention the infestations of insects and even snakes that inhabited the dirt walls. So those settlers who arrived in wooded areas opted to build log cabins instead of sod homes. Like the sod construction, the log cabin could be built in a few days using simple tools, often only an axe. But it was much more comfortable. There's evidence that the first log cabins were introduced by Swedish settlers as early as the 1700s, but other immigrant settlers quickly adopted the construction. First, you build a foundation of rocks to keep the logs away from dampness that might cause them to rot. Then you cut down the trees and square off the logs, cutting notches in the top and bottom of each end so they could fit together when they were stacked at the corners. And it also had the advantage of assuring structural integrity. And there were several types of notching techniques that were used, depending on the skill of the builder. In any case, with notching, no nails were required. And that was good, since nails had to be shipped into towns and then transported out to the new settlements. But there were gaps in the walls, so these had to be filled by a technique called chinking. In chinking, grass, hay, moss, and mud were worked into rolls about a foot long and maybe 4 inches wide, and then they were inserted into the cracks between the logs. These rolls were commonly referred to as mudcats and were very effective in keeping out the cold and keeping in the heat. Of course, the tighter the logs, the fewer chinks were required, and that's important because the chinks were the weakest part of the cabin. And with the expansion and contraction that resulted from freezing and thawing, well, chinking tended to deteriorate and needed constant maintenance and repair. Okay, there was usually a stone or brick fireplace along one wall, and the roof was usually made of wood shingles. So you can imagine this was quite an improvement over the sod house. The advantages were that the home could be kept clean. Even though the floor was usually dirt or gravel because flat boards were difficult to obtain, it was still an effective shelter to keep out the rain and dust. Later, at the end of the 1800s, when the railroads brought materials such as asphalt shingles, tar paper, and finished boards to the frontier, the sod house was abandoned for one-room board shanties covered with tar paper. Whether this was an improvement is subject to debate. For one thing, since they were often built without foundations, the harsh winds of the prairies literally blew the shanties away. Still, many settlers considered the shacks preferable to the old soddies, even though they weren't as easy to heat and cool. To go back to the log cabin for a minute, the effect of new construction materials on the log cabin was aesthetic, as well as practical. The logs were often covered on the outside by finished boards and on the inside with plaster, which gave the cabins a more finished look and improved insulation. And by this time, the old one-room 10 by 12 was also being replaced with larger homes with several rooms. The frontier settlers had weathered the hardships of their first 5 years. They'd received their claims, and they and their homes were a permanent part of the great Western expansion.
29. What is the lecture mainly about? 30. How does the professor organize his lecture? 31. What does the professor imply about construction materials for early homes? 32. What is the evidence for the inexpensive price of a sod home? 33. Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
Later, at the end of the 1800s, when the railroads brought materials such as asphalt shingles, tar paper, and finished boards to the frontier, the sod house was abandoned for one-room board shanties covered with tar paper. Whether this was an improvement is subject to debate.
Why does the professor say this?
Whether this was an improvement is subject to debate.
34. In the lecture, the professor identifies attributes for different frontier homes. Indicate whether each attribute refers to a sod house or a log cabin. Click in the correct box for each phrase.